most important thing for education and for students with disabilities is because it has such long-lasting effects into adulthood. So I've actually worked with individuals. My youngest was 3 weeks old when I did early intervention. And the oldest person I worked with was probably in his 70s, all with disabilities and in a variety of settings. I've worked in homes with early intervention, school settings, community settings. I even worked in the dreaded sheltered workshops. So I taught vocational skills, I taught independent living skills, and all of it boils down for me to are individuals having a quality of life or a life of quality. And the only way to really achieve that is through inclusion at the early years, and not only in school, but in society. So I love putting this presentation together, and I'm going to start. Let's see if I can. Okay. So I like to reflect back on, where we've come. This is the professor in me. I loved looking at the history of disabilities. And when I thought about, going into classrooms, I go into a lot of classrooms, or I did when I did field supervisions for my teacher candidates. Sometimes I walked away feeling really sad that the classrooms, if I turn them all to black and white, don't look very different from what they did years ago, except there's one in this set that looks different. And why is that? Which one would you say? I will give you the answer, because remember what happened when we had students with disabilities. Society felt that the best thing for them was for them to go to institutions and go into these separate classrooms when we finally got them into schools. And we started grouping them according to their disability, so they all start to look the same. But the reality is, and that's your peer model, those are the only kids you have exposure to. And not only that, I've come to believe that it's not good for the teachers. Because teachers also start to lower their expectations. And it's a natural thing. They become a product of that environment. So when I look at this picture here, you can see that's different. And it's because there's a variety of children in that classroom. You don't just have all the kids that they're all in wheelchairs, or they're all in a stander, or they're all sitting in a circle. I don't know how these teachers can run a circle time when all the kids are nonverbal. Yeah. So what usually happens?
See your pic. I see the 4 people. I can't see your show. What am I doing wrong? What do I need to do to get on your slideshow?
You're on your phone, right?
Yeah. And it was there at first, and I went to unmute it, and I can't. Oh well, just keep going.
I think you have to swipe your screen. See if you swipe it, if you can go to other screens.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
Did that work?
Perfect. I got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Yep. Perfect.
So what I was saying is that when you're in a classroom where there's a lot of typical kids, that's more reinforcing to the teacher, because there's a lot of interaction. And so even the child with a disability is learning from that interaction. So the models are there for them. But if you have them all in the same, all with the same disabilities, the students have no peer models to learn from. So we've learned that historically, that even though this was kind of a benevolent, society thought that they were doing these kids a favor, they really were not. And when you talk about the history of particularly children with Down syndrome, it is phenomenal how far we've come. Because historically, children with Down syndrome were automatically in institutions. And when early intervention came around, they found that when you started early intervention programs, that the kids actually could develop more fully and then be more ready for school. And then when they went into inclusive settings in schools, they actually performed better. But any parent probably could have told you that. So what I think is really exciting is there's this tremendous movement for inclusion, and the National Down Syndrome Society actually has an inclusion statement. And what I like about this is that the National Down Syndrome Society does not believe in segregated environments as placement, primary or partial, for any student. And I'll talk more about primary versus partial. And that inclusive education prepares individuals for success as self-determined adult citizens in the workforce and community. Individuals with Down syndrome are working, getting married, serving on boards, volunteering, and otherwise reaching their full potential as adults in their communities. And the educational setting should prepare them for such experiences. We are no longer, what we were historically doing was just preparing children to be able to manage their own self-care needs, be able to use the bathroom, be able to eat on their own, wash their face. But we're expecting more now, and we're seeing it's so great that in the news, you're constantly seeing stories about individuals with Down syndrome really breaking barriers. And it's because we've come this far with early intervention and inclusive schooling. And we also have federal law that says that any removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. I use that phrase all the time in IEP meetings. When the school team says, we think this kid should go to a self-contained or developmental preschool, whatever, I say, are you saying that you have already implemented supplementary aids and services and that placement in a general education classroom cannot be achieved satisfactorily? And usually that stumps them for a while. And then they try to justify it. And then we go round and round. And finally, it's true. They cannot justify the segregated placement. Okay. We also have Arizona law that mirrors the federal law, says exactly the same thing. So you could say Arizona law and federal law says that only if after being provided with supplementary aids and services, education in the general education classroom cannot be accomplished satisfactorily. And I do want you to know about these LRE terms because it will help you see and understand when you go to visit a classroom, because as parents, sometimes a school will propose a certain program or a certain classroom, and you will be given the opportunity to go visit it and observe. And I want you to ask yourself, what kind of a classroom is this? What kind of a program is it? So inclusion is usually viewed as a full inclusion, but full inclusion doesn't mean 100% of the time in general ed. There might be some pull out for speech, some pull out for OT, PT. So there might be some services. Now, I always try to get those services pushed in as much as possible, but I'm not opposed to if there needs to be like a 20-minute pull out and at appropriate times. So that would be coded as a level A or preschool, PAI. That means the child attends a regular early childhood program at least 10 hours per week and receives a majority of the special education and related services in the regular early childhood program. Okay, so those are the two codes you look for on the first page of the IEP where it says LRE code. But I also want you to understand the term mainstreaming or integration, because sometimes this gets confused as inclusion. It's when a child spends between 40 to 79% of the day with typical peers, and that code is usually level B. Okay, so if you're spending about half your time in a general education classroom and half your time in a special ed classroom, there's usually a choice made about when that's going to be. The term mainstreaming or integration was used because usually kids went into the general education classroom when it was not academic, okay, because there was this belief that, well, the kid can't handle the academics, so we'll just let him go in for the social, okay, so maybe about 50% of the day. And then we have the self-contained setting, which is a level C. That means the child spends less than 40% of the day with typical peers. So that's really about 2 hours a day. Okay, you have a 6-hour day. It's approximate. So it could be that the child is, and they count lunch in that too, lunch, recess. So it's predominantly a self-contained classroom because the child receives all instruction for the most part in the self-contained classroom and might go for one special, okay, like maybe PE, music, or art. Okay, and I've already said this, and I've already said this. So I like this t-shirt because it explains mainstreaming is like visiting and inclusion is belonging. It's very difficult to feel part of a classroom when you only go there for half the time. It's kind of like if you have a job and you're half-time employed, you're treated differently than a full-time employed person, right? Because you're just not there all the time. You miss out on some of the stories, things that are going on in the company if you're only there half the time. So we know that there are huge benefits to inclusion. And there's a link there. I will share this PowerPoint. Jenny, I can send it to you and maybe you could send it out. But anyway, because there's a link up there and I love this website, kidstogether.org. There's lots of resources on that website. But this is just a small list. We know that friendships are a benefit. There's increased social initiations, relationships, and networks. Like Jenna was saying, when the children grow up, the children who they grew up together look out for each other. And as adults, they continue that network, that social network. I had an office assistant, a young woman with Down syndrome. She went to the same school from kindergarten through high school. And so she was invited to the proms. She was invited to parties. She's got a Facebook following that's unbelievable. And it's all because she went to school with these peers. What I see happening in some schools is that children are being moved from one school to another. So they never develop that social network. So inclusion by itself isn't the answer. It has to be inclusion in your neighborhood school, the kids that you're going to see on the streets, that you're going to run into at the store. The peer role models for academic, social, and behavior skills. The students that we have supported going into like a private school, maybe an inclusive private school, they learn so much more because the typical peers are modeling saying the alphabet, reading, counting. They're also modeling the social skills. Research consistently shows that kids in inclusive settings achieve more of their IEP goals. There have been some studies that have been really phenomenal where they have matched students by ability, and the ones that went to a self-contained program and the ones who went to an inclusive program, by the time at the end of 6th grade, the kids that had been in the inclusion program had outperformed the kids that had been in the self-contained program. But that's to be expected, right? Because the self-contained program, again, look at that picture of all the kids in the wheelchairs in a circle, or all the kids who look the same, have the same ability levels. The teacher cannot teach at higher levels when that is the group that he or she is provided. They have greater access to the general curriculum. Most kids that are in self-contained programs get a separate curriculum. Okay, so how are they ever going to catch up or keep up with the general curriculum, which means when they're learning about, volcanoes. In the self-contained classroom, they're probably not going to learn about volcanoes. It's a different curriculum. Enhanced skill acquisition and generalization. Generalization meaning that you can use the skills that you've acquired in typical interactions, typical settings. If you're only around kids with disabilities, how do you generalize that skill to use with other peers? Typically in self-contained classrooms, a lot of the kids interact mostly with the adults. So they're not really getting social interactions with peers. There's increased inclusion in future environments. That's the work setting. Greater opportunities for interactions. So when I see a kid with communication goals, and I ask who the peers are, and if most of the peers are also having communication goals, how are they going to interact with each other? It's kind of like having people who don't speak English all together, but they all speak different languages. There's not going to be a whole lot of interaction. There's higher expectations. There's increased school staff collaboration, increased parent participation, and families are more integrated into the community. So the parents themselves become part of the general education family, okay? Because usually it's the classroom the parents get together around, right? Or they meet each other because their kids are invited to a social event together or a birthday party together. But if they're in a self-contained setting, the parents themselves kind of start to be involved primarily in a self-contained social network as well. Okay, so here's this is taken off of the National Down Syndrome Society website. There's a lot of good resources there as well. But there was a study, and this study concluded that teenagers who had been fully included in mainstream classes showed gains of more than 2 years in spoken language skills, 3 years in reading and writing ability on standardized measures, not teacher-made measures, okay, standardized measures. And that these measures of years for typically developing children would equate to 4- and 6-year gains for children with Down syndrome. Because usually children in more self-contained settings or in their typical routines would show about 5 months per year on these measures. But the kids who were placed in, that were fully included, showed 2 years growth. There were gains in math skills, general knowledge, and social independence. This general knowledge thing is really important because we learn a lot through hearing about things. Sometimes people in the self-contained classrooms might think, well, why should I teach that? It's not going to be useful. But if the child is in a general education classroom, they might pick up pieces of that information that they would never have been exposed to had they not been there. So like looking at world maps, they might learn about a country. They might not know a lot about the country, but they learn the name. And so when they hear other people talking about it, they can join in that conversation. It's just exposure. So why are so many students with Down syndrome spending most of their day separated from non-disabled peers? I'm talking about 50% or more of their day is away from non-disabled peers. We have all this evidence. So why is this happening? And I'm going to share this next slide with you because I want you to pay close attention to when the school tells you this. Okay. Historically, least restrictive placement was based on a continuum of services. It was taken from the institutional movement. So it was applied to education. And if you look down at the bottom, This is the most inclusive. General education with no direct special education services or supports. That's your general ed student, or maybe your student on a 504 plan. Okay. You move up the continuum and it becomes more and more specialized. You could have general education within the classroom where the direct and special education services and other related services are pushed into the general ed setting. Okay, so the OT goes in and provides some supports and some teaching when the student is working on writing or coloring, instead of taking them to a separate classroom and having them do those same things. The next thing is pull out special ed services and other related services for a small portion of the school day. Okay, so that might be a resource classroom. They might go there to get some instruction in reading and math. And then we have the special classes with mainstreaming, where most of the classes that they're mainstreamed into are non-academic classes. And then the most restrictive would be the day schools, the private day schools, residential programs, hospital schools, or homebound instruction. Now, if you look at these arrows, okay, it says move this way only as far as necessary, okay, and return this way as rapidly and feasible as possible. This model makes sense to most parents. So the school will tell you, let's start here, pull out special education services and other related services for a small portion of the school day, and we'll go down the continuum as he or she becomes more ready. This is the continuum is supposed to go down. Return this way as rapidly and feasible as possible. Don't buy it, okay? We called it, this is why when this continuum was first introduced, we thought it made sense. But in reality, it came out, this researcher wrote an article called Caught in the Continuum, because children are oftentimes placed in.
Susan, you're breaking up on.
Okay.
You're breaking up on me. Can everyone else hear you? Okay.
I can hear fine. Jenna, you're breaking up a little bit when you were talking, but I can hear Susan.
Okay.
I can hear as well.
Okay, so when you're looking at this, a lot of times the school will say, let's
Susan,
start
can you
here.
hear me?
I can hear you, Jenna. So they might tell you, we'll start here and we'll return as rapidly and feasible as possible, but you will stay at that point in the continuum. Okay. Now I've had some other experiences where a student from another district or another state came into Arizona school and had an IEP that said general education within the class, direct services, really a full inclusion IEP. And the school team started them there and rapidly moved them up to this golden color. By the time I met the parent, she was frustrated. She said, they told me we would go down as soon as they just wanted to provide some extra help, just give a boost. And then they would go back to this green level as soon as possible. That was just not going to happen. Okay, so don't buy this argument that you have to start here and we'll move up or down the continuum as quickly as possible. The continuum has not worked. Okay, so I'm going to put an X on that. Okay. Nope. So let's talk about LRE in preschool. And I noticed, Stacy, you have a 6-year-old and Gianna, you have a 4-year-old. So I'm going to focus more on the younger ages, although I want you to pay attention to the full lifespan, because we're talking about inclusion for life, not just preschool, not just elementary school. and then they go to some sheltered workshop or some segregated setting as adults, okay? We're preparing them for life, to live as adults in inclusive environments. And that's why you're doing this. So back in 2015, the Office of Special Education Programs, that's the federal office in the Department of Education, came out with this policy statement. And it's shocking that they have to come out with this because most people that I knew said, well, aren't preschoolers the easiest to include? The differences between a kid with a disability and a kid without a disability, the gap is not so huge. They're kind of, and preschool is more play and learning sort of these prerequisite skills. But they had to come out with a statement that basically said that there's a scientific basis for the benefits of inclusion. Okay. They make significant developmental and learning progress in inclusive settings. And that some studies have shown that children with disabilities in inclusive settings experience greater cognitive and communication development than children with disabilities who are in separate settings, with this being particularly apparent among children with more significant disabilities. In other words, the kids who have more significant disabilities benefit better, have greater benefit from an inclusive setting. And that kind of makes sense, but those are the kids that were getting placed into developmental preschools or self-contained preschools for all sorts of reasons I'll go over. Further, children with disabilities tend to have similar levels of engagement as their typically developing peers and are more likely to practice these newly acquired skills in inclusive settings as compared to separate settings. You have more people to interact with, more people to practice those skills with. High quality inclusion that begins early and continues into school likely produces the strongest outcomes. Okay, and I've already said basically the other things. So this is for early childhood. I think that people started going, wait a minute, we need to be looking at preschool. In 2012, the Dear Colleague letter said that they specifically said that the LRE, the least restrictive environment requirements, apply to all students, including preschool children, ages 3 to 5. And that that school teams needed to consider placement options, such as Head Start, maybe regular kindergarten, like if they're old enough, like maybe 4 years old, but they don't have a preschool program. Preschool classes that are offered by the public school system, private kindergarten or preschool. So private kindergarten or private preschool, group child development centers or childcare. And if private preschool is necessary in order to receive a free and appropriate public education, it must be offered at no cost to the parent. I really want parents of preschoolers to get this, okay? Because what happens is they go to the school, they have their child evaluated at 3 years old, and the school says, we found your child eligible, and we would like to offer you placement in our developmental preschool. And that's the only conversation. There's never a conversation about, well, what about least restrictive environment? Are there any private? So I've had some cases where the parent actually knew that they wanted an inclusive preschool. And so when we attended the meeting, we asked, is there a general education preschool that's operated by this district? Some districts said yes, and some districts said no, we don't have one. The ones that said yes tried to say, well, the child has to be potty trained. That's discrimination, right? So they had to allow that child to attend the typical preschool program. If there was a regular preschool, that the district was running. If they did not have one, then we asked for a private placement. Okay, so a lot of the preschools in Arizona do run a preschool, but the parents have to pay for it. The parents of typical kids have to pay for the private preschool. If there is no free preschool program for kids with, that's a general education preschool, the school district must pay for that program. So even though kids who are typical must pay for it because they don't have a right to preschool, but kids with disabilities have a right to preschool and they have a right to an inclusive preschool. So we have gotten districts to pay for the private preschool option. Okay, so don't settle for there's no, we don't have a free preschool for kids with disabilities, because your next question should be, do you have a private preschool or a preschool that typical kids pay for? And if you know there's a preschool program on the school campus that's near your school, near your home, you should ask for that as an option. Okay. All right, so in 2017, Office of Special Education Programs is still upset because they said despite the expansion of the programs, there has not yet been a proportionate expansion of inclusive early learning opportunities for young children with disabilities. So now they're saying we're reaffirming our commitment to inclusive preschool education programs. They basically are saying that okay, children with disability, okay, they're actually asking states to report on how many students, preschool students, are being provided with an inclusive early childhood education program, because the federal government is funding these programs. So they want to make sure that the numbers, that there's enough children with preschool age with disabilities are getting access to inclusive early childhood programs. So what happened was, last year, I think 2018, the Arizona Department of Ed also came out with a letter telling school districts that they must be providing inclusive preschool options for children with disabilities. Okay, because surprisingly, the IDEA data was showing that a high percentage of children with disabilities were spending most of their time in self-contained settings. So in preschool, what I usually advocate for is a model of teaching called embedded instruction. In the preschool setting, these children can learn in regular settings by being provided systematic teaching in natural environments. So what that means is if the child has a goal to ask for things, maybe it's a communication goal, make a request, that everyone on the school team knows that that's that child's IEP goal. And every opportunity throughout the day, they give the child the opportunity to ask for something, okay? So maybe it's making a request. I've done this before where maybe we're playing with toy cars and I hold the car and I cue or I prompt the child to ask me for it. Why do I have to go to a separate speech room to work on that skill? You embed that in the typical routines, and parents can do this too at home. So I say, you know, when they said that a child is learning his numbers, so he has to go to the self-contained, go to the special education classroom to learn number identification. I go, gee, aren't there numbers in a typical general education preschool classroom? Are there numbers throughout the school? Can we, as we're walking around, I ask, what's this number? What's this number? This is a number 3. Can you find another 3? So this is all strategies for having kids work on the skills in the natural setting using typical materials. Okay, and there's a link there. It's a strategy that we also use for elementary school kids. Okay, embedded instruction. All right, so LRE and K-12. In those settings, we need, I used to teach the pre-service teachers effective instructional procedures, and these are just some of them. Because if they can learn the strategies, they can apply those strategies in any setting. I think people think that these specialized teaching strategies can only happen in the self-contained or special education classroom. They can happen anywhere, and they should be utilized in all settings. We can provide systematic instruction in all settings. We can use appropriate cueing and prompting strategies. We can also do the embedded instruction in all settings. So if a kid is working on writing their name, and I've done this before, writing their first name, I will have them write their name throughout the day on various pieces of paper. Maybe when we're playing outside, maybe when they're doing an art project. Oh, got to write your name on that. Why have the child go to a special education classroom and write their name 10 times? We found that the kids don't learn it quicker that way. They learn it quicker if it's distributed throughout the day and it's frequent and it's in a lot of different settings using different materials. So it's actually more effective if you can work on those skills in an inclusive setting. And then when we get into the elementary school years, we really need to be thinking about accommodations and modifications. These are skills that teachers need to learn, but not all teachers understand how to do this, or they're not given the time to do it. So you as the parent will want to make sure that on the IEP, there are sufficient resources and supports provided to the teachers so that your child will get the necessary accommodations and modifications. So an accommodation is the child is completing the same task but differently. So you see here, this child may not be able to handwrite but can keyboard. Okay, so that's an Alpha Smart where it's a portable keyboard. Or you might need to change the task significantly, and that would be considered a modification. This chart here is the elements of a story. So let's say the kids have read a story and you're given like a series of pictures, and this is a graphic organizer, and they put pictures of anyone that's a character in the story, where the story took place, and then provide some additional pieces of information. It would be modified in different ways. But as you can imagine, somebody has to make this, okay? So that has to be a teacher, or eventually a paraprofessional can also do it once they're trained. But usually you will need either the special education teacher needs to have that training, or you will want an inclusion specialist. So they might not be told that they have to write a whole story or answer the questions in a written format. They might address reading comprehension by filling in a graphic organizer like this. Okay. And there's also, I really think it's important that schools think about peer tutoring. And there are programs out there. And so this is just a resource that you could take a look at. It's called the Kentucky Peer Tutoring. It's really more for older students. But what's nice is that students actually complete these modules. And what I found is helpful is paraprofessionals could also complete these modules. And it gives them some really nice ideas about not only disabilities, but also how to support an individual with disabilities. So I'm not going to go into details into that, but I wanted you to have that resource. Okay, post-secondary transition. So this is when the kid's in high school. And I'm going to go through this really quick, but I want you to keep this in mind because transition comes up quickly, okay? When we're talking about kids in high school or 18 to 22 working on work skills, we also want to make sure that these are in least restrictive environments. So they're in typical job settings, typical community settings, not like a sheltered workshop or some day program. We are not preparing the students for those settings. We are preparing them for an inclusive adulthood. Okay, and I thought this was really interesting that the National Down Syndrome Society on their website, they have this quote, a 1988 study by Affleck et al. Spanning 15 years found that students with disabilities educated in inclusive settings had an employment rate of 73%, while those in segregated programs had an employment rate of 53%. Ferguson and Ash found that the more time students with disabilities spent in regular classes, the more they achieved as adults in employment and continuing education. Stunning. This was in the 80s.